Hey, good people, what is up? Welcome to Decode, Recode. It's Stephen Kotler, Executive Director of the Flow Research Collective, coming at you live. Okay, not so live, but anyways, I'm coming at you. Wanted to welcome you to the very first edition of Decode, Recode. The goal here is to decode the thousands and thousands of papers that have been written on flow and flow-related topics. It's a vast literature on peak performance, and it's sitting there, and I want to break it down for you. And then, so you can kind of recode yourself, we're going to try to make the science, the information, as practical and applicable as possible. We're going to try to figure out how we can, as a collective, run experiments to validate the ideas that we're most interested in, to take them a little further. That's the point here, is make you a little bit better, give you some individual experiments you can run in your life, a way to sort of take this stuff, make it your own, take it further. That's the hope. What we're going to talk about today is mental imagery and flow. And since science is always a voyage, a discovery, well, we're going to focus specifically on a study run on flow and golf and mental imagery. I want to also talk about how we got there. Before we do that, I want to talk about why we're going to talk about flow and golf. I personally, not a golfer, not interested in the sport, could care less. But what I like about golf and what I like about studies of golf is it's so damn hard, and it's so much like a day at the office. Golf is a string of difficult, critical decisions made one after another as you're getting more tired as you go along while you're trying to tune out a lot of distractions. And that is sort of similar to everybody's workday. So I think there's a much better kind of one-to-one correspondence between golf and what we do all day with our lives than, say, basketball or skiing or kite surfing. Take your pick. The only technical term I'm going to use today that you guys might need to know is transient hypofrontality. If you're familiar with flow and familiar with any of this work, then you've heard the term before. It dates actually back, the idea of transient hypofrontality actually dates back to work done by a woman named Nora Voka, who runs NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse. And transient hypofrontality dates back to early drug abuse studies in the 90s and then altered state studies in the thousands and forward. And the idea with transient hypofrontality is that under certain conditions, large swatches of the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right behind your forehead, the part of your brain that governs higher cognitive functions, long-term planning, complex logical decision-making, sense of morality, your sense of willpower, all that, so-called executive functions. That's in the prefrontal cortex. Transient, temporary, hypo, H-Y-P-O, means to slow down, to shut down, to deactivate, and frontality, the prefrontal cortex. So in transient hypofrontality, large swatches of the prefrontal cortex shut down. This happens for a variety of reasons. In flow, it happens because the brain is performing an efficiency exchange. It is taking energy that you need for focus and attention and giving you more of it, and it's shutting down non-critical parts of the brain at that moment in time to facilitate this shift. So that's transient hypofrontality. That's the only idea you're going to really need to know. And before I can sort of get into our golf study, I want to tell you about a couple other studies that seem to influence it. The first one was the work of a guy named Lars Erik Unestal, who way back in the Lars Erik, by the way, is a really famous Swedish sports psychologist. Invented one of their big kind of frameworks for training athletic ability, and he's been around forever. Really smart, bright guy. Anyways, back in 1983, he proposes that he thinks hypnosis is going to have a really big impact on flow. And he thinks you can use hypnosis as a way to speed people's entrance into flow, to increase the intensity of their flow experience, possibly increase performance. Now, this idea gets really picked up by a guy named John Pates, P-A-T-E-S. I don't know how it's pronounced. He's a sports psychologist at the University of Durban in Buxton. When he starts this work, he's now at Hartspurdy, and he picks up this idea and he runs with it. And the first thing he does is a really small hypnosis and golf study. Now, here's the reason hypnosis matters. In hypnosis, you're essentially using guided mental imagery plus breath to try to deactivate parts of the prefrontal cortex. Same kind of process. Transient hypofrontality is present during hypnosis. So the thinking is, since transient hypofrontality is present during flow, you could use one to facilitate the other. And John Pates, he does a very small study, right? He hypnotizes 3 subjects and has them play golf. He hypnotizes 3 subjects and uses a kind of golf-based imagery protocol. And when he sends out these guys out onto the golf course repeatedly over and over, by the way, small study subject groups, so not a lot of subjects. And the reason is he wanted them to play a lot of golf so he could get really valid results on their performance and what happens out there in the field. So 3 subjects, 2 out of 3 of them get into flow much more easily during golf. He then during rounds of golf. He then repeats this study with putting and gets the same effect. Then, in a more interesting study, he wants to see, okay, it's worked with amateur golfers. Let's see if it works on tour. Let's see if it works with professional golfers. He does the same thing with elite senior European tour golfers. And in this time, he takes them through this is the same protocol, but it's kind of been cemented in by now. He hypnotizes them, starts out with a breath progression, so deeper breaths as you count backwards for 10 kind of thing. This goes into progressive muscle relaxation, so tense individually every muscle of your body, get a feel for what it feels like tensed, get a feel for what it feels like relaxed, right? And then you go through a visualization. It is a multi-sensory visualization. So you're trying to remember a past experience of peak performance, and you're trying to remember how it felt, how you felt during all aspects of that performance. He gets a huge jump. Golfers, professional golfers, who in the baseline portion of the study shoot 73 shots per round, suddenly are shooting 68 shots per round after the invention. Flow improves from a mean score of 119.3 to 151.6. It's a fairly big leap in flow intensity. And what they discover is they think the reason hypnosis is doing this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, it doesn't really go into transient hypofrontality so much, but they say, look, it's improving fun. People are having more fun after this hypnosis practice, right? When we have more fun, we like it more, we pay more attention. Focus also goes up, and there's a relaxation and calm effect. That's really important because of the challenge skills balance, right? Often called the golden rule of flow, flow's most important trigger. The idea that we pay the most attention to the task at hand and thus can drive the most flow when the challenge of that task slightly exceeds our skill set. You want to stretch but not snap, right? So how calm you are, how relaxed you are, that lowers the challenge level. One of the big elements in that challenge level is confidence. And related to that, we also see during hypnosis, and this is actually how we know it's transient hypofrontality, or one reason, the inner critic quiets down. The inner critic, that nagging voice in your head, right? Your inner Woody Allen, as my old partner Jamie Wheel used to like to say, quiets down. So that's a transient hypofrontality activity. The inner critic lives in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, sort of the part of your brain that's off to the side of your forehead. And that's where that nagging voice makes its home, shuts down in flow, shuts down in hypnosis. Big deal. All right, so that's the early work, right? They then repeat the hell out of this study. They do it with basketball players shooting three-pointers. They do it with netball shooters. I have no idea, by the way, what the hell a netball shooter is, so if anybody knows, please tell me. Cyclists, tennis players, all have significant measurable effects. Typically, all of these are very small studies, but 75% of the participants as an average notice a significant increase in flow, and 95% see an increase in performance. And I should also point out that this was done with hypnosis or imagery, right? The imagery ideas, right, going from hypnosis into imagery, because we're not looking at hypnosis and golf and flow, we're looking at imagery, mental rehearsal, right? So a lot of this work dates back dates to a Miami University psychologist named Weinberg, who has done a bunch of work on imagery and athletics, and back in 2000 wants to see if motivational imagery, so there's all kinds of different imagery people use. Motivational imagery involves imagining yourself, say you're going to play golf, standing at a tee shot, feeling confident, feeling gritty, or you imagine yourself shooting a bad shot and then bouncing back with a great shot. That's mental grit rehearsal, you would call it, I guess. So the idea here is that good imagery is going to, the hypothesis at least, that they had sort of going in, and they ended up proving it, is that imagery serves to emphasize clear goals, known flow trigger, help tune the challenge skill balance, also a known flow trigger, might also increase our sense of control, and a sense of control is something that shows up in flow, and seems to facilitate loss of self, because you don't have to think about it so much, what you're doing, because you've rehearsed it more. And in his study, they found exactly that, and that they found that the use of imagery ends up increasing flow. Another study done at the University of Tehran looks at, and this was done in 2017, so a fairly recent study. The Weinberg study was done back in 2000, and this one was done by Ramina Ashkangian. I'm slaughtering her name. I'm not even sure it's a her, and Hadi Alana. And this showed up in the Journal of Research in Humanities and Social Science. And what they were looking at is the effect of motivational imagery versus cognitive imagery on flow and airgun shooting performance, so target shooting performance. And motivational imagery, we've talked about what that is. Cognitive imagery is word repetition. So it's really words that reference exactly what you want to do. So in shooting, it'd be things like place the butt of the gun on hip, widen your stance, that kind of shit. Versus imagine how confident you feel before firing a shot. And what they discovered is that if you're looking at both flow and performance, motivational imagery works best, cognitive imagery works next best, and then not doing either is worse. And it's a huge difference. And there's a huge difference in the amount of flow they got and their leap in performance. So this brings us to the study I actually want to talk about, which was done by Adam Nichols and Remco Pullman from the University of Hull. And what they wanted to look at is the effect of individualized imagery interventions on golf performance and flow states. And I like this study, even though it only has 4 participants, because it stretches out for a really, really long time. They played 28 rounds of golf over 2 months. So this was really an active study, and they had a lot of data to kind of work with. And of the 4 players, each of them went in with goals. There was a woman who wanted to improve her shot from the tee, and there were 3 players, men, who wanted to improve their chipping and their putting. And as I said, they played 28 rounds of golf over 2 months. They measured the intensity of flow using Susan Jackson and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's flow short scale, which is also what we use. It's one of the most validated flow metrics. And for imagery, what they did is they had people follow a script. So they brought them into to the lab, and they made a tape together. Or I guess now they would make a digital recording, but back then they made a tape. And it included pre-shot preparation, hitting the shot, and what you would feel like after the shot. And what they wanted to increase was the feelings of confidence and mental toughness. And they also practiced refocusing after a bad shot. And so what they would do is they made this tape. It was about 7 to 8 minutes long. And then the people would practice 5 times a week with the tape, doing the imagery. And as I said, they played 28 rounds of golf over 2 months. 3 out of 4 reported a significant increase in flow, intensity, and frequency. It was really, really big for 1 player. It was less big for 2 more, and with the woman, it didn't show up at all. Interestingly, afterwards, because they did post-tests a month and then 6 months out, 1 of the players returned to baseline. The other 3 stayed elevated. all three of the chippers got better. The interesting thing was the woman. The woman was the one who wanted to get better off the tee, and she actually, visualization did lead to increased incidences of flow, but it did not lead to increased incidences of performance. She didn't get better, which was really weird. One of the reasons may be, in interviews afterwards, they found that the woman couldn't stay out of her head in a really strange way. She would compare her imagined performance, meaning what she used for the visualization, against her real performance in real time, right? So if she was swinging off the tee and didn't quite match her imagined version of her perfect shot off the tee, she would notice while she was swinging off the tee and would screw up her performance. And I mention this because I had absolutely the same experience for a decade while skiing. And it was actually one of the biggest blockers to flow I've ever encountered. It was wild. So when I started out skiing, covering professional athletes as a journalist in my 20s, I found that I would often, afterwards, I'd ski with these guys. I was always behind them. I was always chasing them from behind, but I could always have a really good picture of what they looked like skiing. So I'd have this picture of what pro athletes looked like while skiing in my head. And then while I was skiing, I was trying to map what I was doing onto these pro athletes. And for a decade, this was sort of happening automatically. I never really thought about it, but I really had a difficult time getting into flow. I found I really couldn't do it. And I could only really pull it off like 10% of the time, maybe if there were other people around to sort of distract me from my own head. And one day I realized I was out with a group of skiers, and I realized that nobody actually ever noticed what another skier looked like. The thing I was trying to do in my head, this metric, wasn't actually a metric that any skiers ever used. In fact, if you were with a group of skiers, the only thing anybody really ever notices was, do you get to the chairlift at the same time? Does anybody have to wait for you? So I was like, oh, let me just change my metric to speed. All I care about is never stop turning, always keep moving, speed, speed, speed. That became my metric, and the feeling of speed began to be what I focused on. And I went from 10% flow to like 95% flow while skiing. It was the biggest unlocking move of my career as a skier. So I've had this exact problem. The reason I'm bringing all this stuff up is it's been a long time since researchers have really stumbled onto a new flow trigger. There are 22 known flow triggers, and motivational imagery is not among them. Now, interestingly, I don't even know if you could call it a flow trigger, because motivational imagery, as I mentioned earlier, seems to facilitate, seems to pull a bunch of other flow triggers. It activates the challenge skills balance, right? If you can visualize yourself doing the thing and feeling confident and feeling gritty and performing at your best, right? When you get there, your mental rehearsal, the task is a little less challenging. You got some more practice laps through there. You have a little more confidence, right? The risk level is decreased a little bit. All of this allows you to tune the challenge skills balance. Obviously, it's clear goals as well, and clear goals lowers cognitive load. You know exactly what you want to do now. You know exactly what you want to do next. So when you're in the moment, your mind doesn't have to wander. This is really, really clear. There may be some other stuff going on. So we know that pattern recognition, when you link ideas together, you get a little squirt of dopamine, another flow trigger there. And what's interesting about mental imagery is sometimes when the feeling of your performance, or the feeling of your experience, or the visual cues of your experience, etc., map onto what's been imagined, you get a sensation of pattern recognition. I'll give you a really funny example of this one. This story, I think, is actually in West of Jesus. It was my first day in Hawaii. I was in Hawaii surfing, and I was terrified, by the way, to be in Hawaii. I was really scared as a surfer. I was really terrified of going to Hawaii. The thing I was scared most of was getting caught kind of at an outer reef break or far away from the shore when big waves suddenly started coming in, because that can happen in Hawaii, and I really didn't want it. That stuff can go from, head high to triple overhead very, very quickly. So this is exactly what happens to me on my very first day. I'm in Waikiki, friendliest waves you could possibly get. I'm out longboarding, and I'm at Queens. I paddle over to Kings. Both these breaks are a little crowded, but the swell's coming up, and I notice this break really far out there. Nobody's really out there. It looks like it's going off, and I start paddling. And I'm going paddling towards a spot called Publix, which is like 10, 15 minutes away. I'm tired and cold by this time. It takes me a little longer, and the swell's coming up, and it's getting colder and colder, and the sun's starting to go down, and the waves are getting really big. And I get out there, and no sooner do I get out there, and it goes from like head high to double overhead to triple overhead. I've never, at that point in my life, I've been out in triple overhead surf, I think twice. One time I nearly drowned, and the other time I was at Sunset Beach in Los Angeles, which is a really wimpy beginner wave and doesn't really count. So no real experience out there. And the set came in. It was a huge set. It was like 6 waves in a row, and each was bigger than the last. And I was exhausted. And the triple overhead waves, and I knew if I didn't catch the first wave, I wasn't going to have the strength to paddle over any of the other waves. And I thought I was going to drown, and I was terrified. And these waves were giant, and I'm paddling my ass off to catch the first wave, and I'm terrified, and I'm pushing down into the wave, and I'm looking straight where I'm going, and it looks like this giant pit, like 3 stories below me, and suddenly I turn over to the left, and I look over at the shoulder, and the shoulder is gentle and sloping and not this huge cliff. And suddenly my brain goes, click, pattern recognition. I know what to do with that. And I pushed to my feet, sailed off into it, deep flow state, surfed all the way into the beach basically, and lived. But that's not a one-to-one match. But basically I recognized the shoulder, right? It looked familiar. I went, this image is familiar. I know what to do here. And everything calmed down. I dropped into the challenge. The challenge skills balance lowered immediately, right? And I dropped into the zone. So imagery appears to be able to do all of that. So I'm not saying make yourself an audio recording, though you can. What I am saying is that motivational imagery seems to be able to increase both flow and performance over time. We see this a lot in sport. What I'm interested in is, how do I do it in writing? How does it work during business hours? What do we do then? And so what I'm suggesting is that over the next month, you guys run experiments in your own life. Maybe you want to make a motivational imagery tape so you can take yourself through the experience. Maybe you just want to use it. The thing that I find best and what I like to do and what I've had the best success with, I always say that in high performance, you want to get your biology to work with you rather than against you. And I like post-flow visualization. So this is the most effective visualization stuff I've ever used, and it's the one I use the most. This next month, I'm going to use pre-activity visualizations as well. I'm going to run the same experiment I'm asking you guys to run, but the experiment that I've run the most is after a flow state. So if I get into a flow state while writing during the day, as I'm falling asleep that night, I am visualizing that flow state. And I'm really visualizing exactly what happened when sentences came together and how I felt. I'm really focusing on how I felt in flow in that moment. And I do this with skiing, right? And it's usually only, like if I spent a day skiing and maybe the whole day was spent in flow, or a large portion of it was spent in flow, there's only like a 10-second peak moment, right? It's 1 or 2 turns. It's a little tiny section of a chute, something like that I visualize. But that's when I had the most sensation, and it's the sensation of confidence. It's the sensation of grit that you really, really, really seem to want to get at. It's the phenomenological memory. How did this experience make me feel? That seems to be the strongest. So whenever I get into a flow state, as I'm falling asleep that night afterwards, I am always rehearsing it. And if it was a really deep flow state, I will do that 2 or 3 nights in a row because I find I can get the same sensations back and really get a sense of what it felt like to be in flow while writing or skiing, etc., etc. I find this is incredibly, incredibly useful for me. And there you have it, our very first edition of the Decode, Recode, High Performance Training Podcast, whatever. I don't know what we're even going to call this thing yet. I don't really want it to be a podcast, and we're going to make slides to go along with it. And I hate the term webinar. It makes me feel like somebody's trying to sell me something, and I don't want to sell you anything here. I just want you guys to run this experiments and send us back information about what you discovered. So thanks so much. Thanks for being part of the collective. I'll catch you guys next month. Stephen Kotler out.